Okay, so the next job is fitting these two silver frame parts onto the bottom tray, and we do that with these two button head screws. So I'll go ahead and do that. Okay, that's those installed, and be aware that you're screwing these on at the middle hole position, and when you look at this particular frame, there's this bit is towards the front of the machine, this bit I guess towards the back, and you're using the holes towards this shape here at the front, not these rearward holes when you bolt these on. So our next job is putting the pinion on the motor. Very straightforward. Sits on the motor shaft like that. And then look at the motor here. You can see that there's a flat on the shaft which will line up with the hole through the pinion, and then we put the grub screw, the set screw in there to hold that in place. And then in terms of bolting the motor into the mount, you see the top of the motor has 4 screw holes in it. The mount has 4 screw holes in it, and we've got 4 screws and 4 washers. So all pretty straightforward. I'll go ahead and do that and show you what it looks like when it's done. Okay, so there we have the build of the motor complete. 4 screws with the washer underneath them, and some Loctite on into the motor, and then the pinion onto the shaft, grub screw with Loctite on it onto the flat. Now it's worth bearing in mind that we're probably going to have to adjust the height of the pinion later to make sure that it butts up nicely against the support bearing for the motor shaft. So we may well have to undo that bearing and do some adjustment later. The other thing is, I've positioned the motor in the motor mount so that the wires are towards this cutout in the back, because it's this part of this back part of the motor mount that's going to be facing towards where your speed controller will be mounted later on. Okay, so the next thing we're going to be working on is the build up of the main frames. There's quite a few parts to this next part of the build, so I'll try and take this as a step at a time, show you what I'm doing as I'm going along. But initially I'm going to mount some of the bits that need to go into the frames loosely into the frames so that they're in position so you can see where they ought to be, and then I'll tighten the whole thing up to build the completed initial part of the frame set build. Okay, so for the first part of our frame build I've done the bearing blocks. Things to be taking note of are the bearing support for the motor pinion should have the bearing where it's inserted into this block upwards. If we look at the top main bearing block, again the way it's orientated is the bearing inserted from the top. However, the bearing block underneath that, you can see that the bearing has been inserted from the underside, and that's the only thing you need to be aware of. The other thing is that the screws for mounting all of the bearing blocks are the 6mm shouldered screws, and they're quite easy to identify because there is a shoulder just underneath the head of the screw. Okay, so for this next bit we're going to be putting the canopy mount onto part of the frames, and what we have to do is install one of these threaded rods into the canopy mount, and then that can go through the frames and bolt into this frame brace the other side. Okay, so there we see the outer canopy mount and the frame brace through the frames mounted in that rearward position. Okay, so our next bit is getting these frame strengthener parts bolted onto the outside of our frames, and they basically bolt through the frames and into these metal parts which effectively will bolt the undercarriage on eventually, but they won't bolt onto it just yet until we actually have the undercarriage bolts coming through and into these. So initially we screw these onto the frames, and then once they're on the frames they screw through the bottom plate into the undercarriage. So I'll go through this a step at a time so you can see how it goes. Okay, so here's our first frame strengthener bolted into place. You can see the frame brace here, and it's bolted through into the metal piece underneath there. You can see that from the other side. go, you can see that from the other side, that piece bolted onto the frames. Okay, and we have to do the same for the other frame, same brace, and then we have a canopy mount that bolts in here with a button headed screw to hold it in place. So I'll put that one in next. Okay, so there you have the canopy mount, and the other side we have the button headed screw. Okay, so now we need to go to the rear of the frames and effectively do the same kind of thing at the back here, but the much smaller frames brace on there, and these longer boom support mounts and undercarriage mounts at the back there, so that will go on there like so, and then this piece will kind of sit over it like that, like that, to hold it in place. Okay, so I'll go ahead and do that. Okay, so there we have that mounted at the rear, and we've now got to repeat the mounting of these parts on our opposite frame set, exactly the same. So I'll do that, and then once that's in place, we're in position to be able to bolt the two frame sets together. Okay, so when you've bolted it all together, it should look something pretty much like this. You can see I've bolted the bottom plate in with two shouldered screws either side in the middle here. If we move to the back, you can see the other stuff that we put on bottom of the frames, top of the frames. Pretty much just bolted the two pieces together to form the basic frame set. So once we've done that, we'll go into the manual. The next thing we'll be doing is putting on the front radio tray and bolting the undercarriage on, which effectively will stiffen up this frame set even more. Okay, so this is the next item to be installed, which is the front radio tray, and it bolts in at these positions into our frame set. So I'm going to go ahead and install that into the frames, and you can see that when that's done. Okay, so I just want to point out for the front radio tray, this bottom screw is just one of the 6mm shoulder screw. The top screws are part of the Canopy spacer arrangement. So you've got these rubber pieces which mount onto there with a screw going through the middle. And these are the parts that make up the screw through the middle there. There's a long screw, and then the screw goes through this kind of shouldered insert which fits inside this rubber spacer effectively. So I'll fit those on, and you can see how they look. Okay, so here's one that's ready to be fitted. You can see on the end there, you can see the silver insert. If the camera will focus, you might be able to see it anyway. Yeah, there you go. So you can see the silver insert inside there that the screw's running through, and they just bolt into the upper positions for that front radio tray. So I'll put both of those in now. Okay, so there you see the rubber mounted at the top there, one on each side. Our next step is building up the undercarriage. This is really basic stuff. I'm not going to go through filming all of this. I'm going to put the undercarriage together, and then when that's done, we'll bolt it onto the underside of the frames. Okay, so I've built the undercarriage, and the only thing that I point out that I do that's different to the manual is I mount the rubbers for the skids on the inside rather than the outside here, because what tends to happen is these become loose over time, and then if they're on the outside here, they can just come off of the skid pipe, at the back here, fall off, and you've lost the rubber. Whereas if you mount them on the inside like I have, they can never come off, so you never lose them. Haven't tightened down the grub screws just yet, because we've got to position these struts to fit onto the underside at the right distance apart, so that they'll go onto the underside of our frame set. So that's what I'm going to do next. They're mounted with these screws and washers, which I'll just quickly show you here. The screws and washers, they mount them onto the underside of the frame set. So I'll line it all up, position it up, screw it on, and then once we've done that we can tighten up these grub screws to pinch onto the skid pipes to hold everything in place. Okay, so there we have our undercarriage bolted onto our frame set, and you can see underneath there the screws going into the underside of the frame set, front and rear. That's pretty much it for bolting the undercarriage on. The next part of the install is dealing with installing servos, which I'm probably not going to do just at this point. I'll probably move ahead and get the tail boom onto the model first and then install the servos.